The hum of New York never truly sleeps. Even in the quiet hours before dawn, the city breathes, a rhythm of distant sirens, the whisper of passing taxis, and the faint glow of streetlights brushing against the pavement. But on one particular morning in the early 1970s, the city's heartbeat seemed to pause for a man who had dared to step from the shadows into the spotlight. His name was Joe Colombo. And unlike any mob boss before him, he didn't hide behind the code of silence. He embraced the cameras, smiled for reporters, and treated fame as if it were his birthright. Imagine him standing in front of a crowd at Columbus Circle, sleek suit pressed to perfection, dark hair slicked back, a confident smile that could charm a priest or a prosecutor. Around him, thousands of people waved Italian flags and chanted his name. The summer sun glinted off microphones as journalists leaned in, eager to hear what this Mafia don would say next. Most gangsters lived and died in the dark, but Joe Colombo was different. He believed that the best way to fight his enemies was to stand in plain sight. And for a time, it worked. The story of Joe Colombo is not merely one of crime and consequence. It's a story of contradiction. A man who blurred the boundary between outlaw and celebrity, loyalty and self-promotion. He was both a family man and a feared mob boss, a self-styled activist who used the language of civil rights to defend a criminal empire. To some, he was a hero who stood up for the dignity of Italian Americans. To others, he was a showman who pushed his luck too far. But one thing was certain, he was unforgettable. As the flashbulbs popped and the applause echoed through Manhattan, Colombo's name traveled far beyond the underworld. He became a headline, a television guest, a public figure. His photographs appeared beside those of movie stars and politicians. It was an image carefully crafted, a man of the people, smiling, approachable, even righteous. Yet beneath that polished veneer lay the same world of power, intimidation, and quiet violence that had defined the Mafia for decades. Joe simply gave it a new face. In the calm of your mind's eye, picture the paradox. A mob boss shaking hands with reporters, his words broadcast over radio waves, a man sworn to secrecy now inviting the nation to listen. That image alone feels impossible, almost surreal. And yet, in those years, it was real. Colombo's rise to fame came at a time when the American Mafia was beginning to fracture. The old rules, secrecy, obedience, invisibility, were being challenged by men who wanted more. More money, more recognition, more power. But Joe was the first to transform that hunger into spectacle. He turned the shadows into a stage. It all began with a simple idea. Colombo realized that public outrage could be as powerful as fear. When the FBI started labeling Italian Americans as gangsters in their investigations, Joe saw an opportunity. He framed himself as a defender of his people, launching what he called the Italian American Civil Rights League. On the surface, it was a movement against prejudice. But behind the curtain, it was something more, a shield against scrutiny, a clever disguise for influence. Yet, for those who knew Joe personally, there was genuine conviction in his voice. He spoke of dignity, of heritage, of respect. Maybe he truly believed that his campaign was noble. Maybe it was both, a cause wrapped around ambition. In his speeches, he blended passion with precision. His words were soft but persuasive, his gestures deliberate. Crowds adored him, and for a moment, even the government didn't know how to handle a Mafia boss who had become a public activist. Still, not everyone was impressed. Within the higher circles of organized crime, whispers grew louder. Other dons watched uneasily as Joe's face appeared on television screens. The Mafia had survived for generations because it thrived in silence. Joe was rewriting the rules, and not everyone approved. Some feared his fame would invite unwanted attention, not just from the FBI, but from politicians eager to make examples. Power in the underworld, after all, depends on discretion. Colombo's newfound celebrity was not discretion, it was defiance. At night, as cameras packed up and crowds drifted home, Joe would return to his quiet neighborhood in Brooklyn. Behind closed doors, the man who smiled for the world would sit with his family, enjoying pasta dinners and laughter with his children. To them, he was simply Pop, a provider, a storyteller, a man who brought home gifts and jokes. The tenderness of those moments contrasted sharply with the headlines that followed him each morning. And perhaps that was the heart of his complexity. He wasn't just living two lives, he was performing them. But even as he basked in attention, Colombo couldn't escape the weight of the world he came from. The Mafia isn't built for fame, it's built for control. For silence. And while Joe's popularity made him powerful, it also made him a target. The more he smiled for the public, the more enemies watched from the dark. Each newspaper article, each television appearance, was another spark in a city already filled with gasoline. There's something haunting in the way fame can seduce and betray. Colombo seemed to believe he could tame it, that he could stand in the light without being burned. He believed that the rules that bound every other gangster simply didn't apply to him. For a time, that illusion held. The city adored him, the cameras followed him, and the mob, though uneasy, respected his influence. But in the underworld, admiration is a currency that devalues quickly. What Joe Colombo didn't know, what perhaps no man can ever know, is the exact moment when admiration turns to envy, when power turns to danger. Somewhere among the crowds that cheered for him, eyes were watching with calculation, not applause. Somewhere in those bright summer days, his fate was already sealed. For now, though, the story rests here, in the strange calm of his triumph. A man who had everything, loyalty, fame, a family, and a cause that made him look untouchable. But as we drift further into his story, into the smoky backrooms and silent betrayals, one truth will begin to surface like a shadow in the night. In the world Joe Colombo built, the spotlight is never gentle, and every light eventually fades. And when it does, the darkness remembers everything. Brooklyn in the 1920s was a world of noise and closeness, the rattle of trolley cars, the cries of vendors selling fruit on corners, and the hum of families trying to carve out a life in a new country. In a small apartment above a bakery, Joseph Colombo was born in 1923, into a family that carried both pride and quiet danger. His father, Anthony, had ties to the underworld, a man whose charm masked darker dealings. Joe grew up in the soft haze of cigar smoke and whispered names, learning early that respect was a currency as valuable as money. He was a bright, curious child, polite, well-spoken, the kind of boy teachers noticed for his confidence. But Brooklyn was a teacher too. It taught lessons the classroom couldn't: when to talk, when to stay silent, when to look away. On summer nights, he would hear the rumble of cars pulling up outside, the low voices of men discussing business, and the steady rhythm of footsteps disappearing into the dark. Those sounds became part of him, not frightening, just familiar. The neighborhood was full of men who worked hard during the day and gathered in cafes at night, sipping espresso, playing cards, talking about respect and family. Joe listened carefully. He learned that strength didn't always mean shouting, sometimes it meant keeping your composure while everyone else lost theirs. Even as a teenager, he carried himself with the calm assurance of someone older, someone already studying the invisible rules of power. When his father vanished one day under mysterious circumstances, young Joe felt the first sting of what that world truly cost. The family carried on quietly, dignity intact, but something inside him hardened. He understood that loyalty and danger were two sides of the same coin, and that someday, he would hold it in his own hand. When Joe joined the U.S. Navy during World War II, he was barely out of his teens, restless, ambitious, and eager to prove himself beyond the narrow streets of Brooklyn. The sea promised discipline, purpose, and a chance to see a world far larger than the one he'd known. At first, he embraced it, the salty air, the steady rhythm of drills, the quiet power of belonging to something greater. But the Navy also demanded obedience, and obedience was something Joe struggled with. He wasn't a troublemaker by nature, but rules felt like chains. He questioned orders, challenged authority, and carried himself with the confidence of someone who believed he could make better decisions than the men above him. To some, that confidence looked like arrogance. To Joe, it was survival, the instinct to lead rather than follow. His sharp mind and natural authority made him respected among some shipmates and quietly resented by others. When his defiance finally caught up with him, it came not in a storm or a battle, but through paperwork, an early discharge for insubordination. As the ship pulled away without him, Joe watched from the dock, his uniform crisp, his expression calm. The ocean stretched endlessly before him, vast and indifferent. Somewhere inside, he felt both defeat and clarity. The military's order wasn't for him. He needed freedom, the kind found in backrooms, not barracks. That moment, standing alone by the water, marked the end of his brief attempt at a straight life and the quiet beginning of his journey back into Brooklyn's shadows. The war was over, and Brooklyn was changing. The men who had gone off to fight in Europe returned home to crowded apartments, flickering street lamps, and the hum of a city eager to move forward. Among them was Joseph Colombo, barely in his 20s, lean from his time in the Navy and restless in a way that only men who have seen the world can be. The discipline of military life had never suited him. Now, back on familiar streets, he felt the pull of something older, something that hummed beneath the surface of the city, the quiet heartbeat of the underworld. It was the late 1940s, and Brooklyn had a rhythm of its own. Children played stickball on cracked pavement, women hung laundry between buildings, and at night the neighborhood changed character. The air grew thicker, voices lowered, and deals were made in dimly lit cafes. The Mafia wasn't a distant legend here, it was woven into the neighborhood's daily life, a shadow that provided both fear and stability. Everyone knew someone connected, and everyone understood what not to say. Joe Colombo walked these streets with a quiet confidence. He had always carried himself differently, not like a thug, not like a hustler, but like a man who was observing everything. He had inherited his father's charm, and though his father, Anthony Colombo, had been a small-time enforcer before dying young, Joe remembered the respect people gave him. That kind of respect left a mark. Joe wasn't interested in ordinary work. He wanted what the men in tailored suits had: control, admiration, and a sense of belonging to something larger than himself. He started small, as they all did. A trucking business here, a union job there, legitimate on the surface, but laced with opportunity. The docks were a world of their own, filled with hard labor, whispered payoffs, and quiet men who knew when to look the other way. Joe had a gift for conversation. He didn't bark orders, he spoke softly, making people feel seen, valued. It was that blend of intelligence and charm that caught the attention of men higher up the chain. One evening, in a small cafe off Court Street, Joe met a man who would change his trajectory. His name was Joseph Prophesy, a quiet, devout Catholic, and one of the 5 Mafia bosses who ruled New York. Prophesy wasn't the loud, violent kind. He preferred calm negotiation, and he appreciated men who understood subtlety. Joe impressed him immediately. He was young, articulate, and, most importantly, disciplined. Prophesy saw in him something rare, a man who could make the family money without drawing attention. Under Prophesy's wing, Joe learned the unspoken language of the Mafia. Not just the handshakes and codes, but the rhythm of business. He studied how disputes were resolved without violence, how money flowed from small neighborhood operations up to the top. He understood that true power wasn't in threats, it was in influence. The more people owed you, the more quietly you could control them. By day, Joe's life looked ordinary. He dressed neatly, drove modest cars, and spent time with his young wife, Lucille. They had met not long after the war, and she saw in him the same thing others did, a man with ambition, but also with a gentleness that made her feel safe. She loved his quiet humor, the way he always remembered to bring home flowers, the way he could shift from serious to playful with a single smile. They would walk together on warm evenings, hand in hand, unaware that those moments of peace would one day feel like another lifetime. But behind the scenes, Joe's influence grew. He began managing small rackets, numbers operations, protection deals, and later, union interests. He was good at keeping people loyal. Instead of ruling with fear, he built trust. Men wanted to work for him because he paid on time and treated them with respect. He had an instinct for organization, for turning chaos into structure. The old-timers noticed. The kind of man who could make money without noise was invaluable. Through the late 1940s and into the 1950s, Colombo's reputation spread quietly. He was still far from being a household name, even within the Mafia, but among insiders, he was seen as reliable. He didn't overreach, he didn't flaunt wealth, and he didn't gossip. That made him safe. He learned that patience, in their world, was more powerful than any gun. Brooklyn during those years was a place of contradictions. To the outside world, it was working-class America at its best: families, churches, block parties, the smell of tomato sauce drifting from open windows. But under that surface, the mob kept everything running: the unions that built the skyscrapers, the trucks that carried food across the city, the protection money that kept small businesses safe. It was an ecosystem of order built on quiet intimidation. Joe Colombo was learning to navigate it perfectly. Sometimes, on late nights, he would drive through the city, past docks lit by sodium lamps, past quiet diners and rows of parked cars. The radio would hum softly, and he'd think about the choices he'd made. There was no clear line between right and wrong anymore. In the Mafia, loyalty was morality. The rules of the outside world didn't apply. What mattered was trust, and Joe had earned it. He was invited to meetings that most men his age never saw. Dinners where cigars burned slowly and decisions worth millions were made between courses. Joe didn't speak much during those gatherings, he listened. He understood that words were weapons, and silence was armor. Prophesy liked that about him. So did the other capos. The quiet man who understood everything without needing to prove it. By the mid-1950s, Joe Colombo was managing a handful of legitimate businesses alongside his underworld interests. He had become something of a bridge, a man who could move between the criminal world and the respectable one with ease. He could sit with a priest on Sunday and a bookmaker on Monday, and both would feel comfortable in his company. But even as he thrived, Joe knew there were limits. The Mafia was an empire built on hierarchy, and those above him were men of immense power. Still, something in him stirred, a sense that he was meant for more. Every handshake, every successful deal, every nod from his superiors added to that quiet confidence. He was patient, but his ambition was beginning to take form. In time, the old generation would fade. New opportunities would rise. And Joe Colombo, the polite, well-dressed young man from Brooklyn, would be waiting. The streets had taught him everything he needed to know: how to listen, how to adapt, and how to survive. He was no longer just another neighborhood man chasing small dreams. He was becoming something more. In the soft light of memory, it's easy to see those years as peaceful, the calm before the storm. The young father, the devoted husband, the loyal soldier in a silent war. But beneath the calm, something was shifting. The quiet world Joe had built for himself was preparing to change, and when it did, it would propel him to heights even he could not have imagined. For now, though, picture him as he was then, walking home under the streetlights, the night air cool against his face, the city alive around him. Every step he took was a step deeper into the life that would make him famous, feared, and ultimately, undone. And somewhere, in the distance, the future was already waiting, patient, watchful, inevitable. The path to power in the Mafia was never a sprint, it was a quiet, deliberate climb. Every man who rose through its ranks learned patience, the art of waiting for opportunity to reveal itself in silence. For Joseph Colombo, that patience became his greatest weapon. While others sought power through intimidation, Joe learned to gain it through strategy, charm, and an almost unsettling calmness. By the mid-1950s, the Prophesy crime family controlled a vast portion of Brooklyn's rackets, numbers games, union manipulation, extortion, and smuggling operations that touched nearly every block from Red Hook to Bensonhurst. At the top was Joe Prophesy, an old-school don with a reputation for being both pious and ruthless. He attended Mass daily, donated to charities, and yet, behind closed doors, he demanded unwavering loyalty and tribute from every soldier beneath him. His word was law. And in that rigid hierarchy, Joseph Colombo was making himself indispensable. Joe's early assignments were simple: collecting payments, enforcing debts, managing a small crew that handled union disputes and trucking routes. But what set him apart was how he handled conflict. He wasn't quick to anger. He didn't raise his voice or draw attention. When problems arose, missing money, unreliable workers, or rival encroachments, Joe would walk into a room, speak softly, and leave with everything resolved. No shouting, no bloodshed, just order restored. Men said he had a way of looking at you that made lying feel impossible. That earned him the trust of Carmine Persico, a young enforcer who would later become one of the most feared men in the underworld. Persico saw in Joe a steady hand, someone who understood both the streets and the psychology of power. Together, they learned to balance violence with diplomacy, an understanding that not every victory needed to come through fear. In their world, peace was often more profitable than war. As the years passed, Joe's name began to surface in quiet conversations. "Colombo's reliable," men would whisper. "He gets things done." To a mafia boss, those words meant everything. Reliability was rarer than loyalty. Anyone could swear allegiance, but few could deliver results consistently and without drama. Joe was becoming one of those few. He began handling more lucrative ventures, construction bids, waterfront contracts, and the intricate web of trucking routes tied to the Teamsters Union. These businesses were the arteries of the city, carrying goods, materials, and money. Whoever controlled them held real power. Joe managed to keep his operations efficient and discreet. He paid his superiors on time, never skimmed too much, and always maintained the appearance of legality. Outwardly, he looked like a successful businessman. He drove a modest car, wore tailored suits without flash, and kept his personal life quiet. His wife, Lucille, appreciated that he was home most evenings, dining with the family and tucking their children into bed. Neighbors saw him as respectable, a hard-working man providing for his family. Few suspected that the calm man smiling at the local bakery was already a trusted soldier in one of New York's most powerful crime families. But beneath that calm surface, Joe's ambition simmered. He studied the way the old dons operated, their alliances, their habits, their mistakes. He noticed how greed and arrogance destroyed men faster than bullets ever could. He vowed never to make those errors. The Mafia was filled with impulsive men, but Joe understood that true power required restraint. The more unpredictable others were, the more control a patient man could quietly accumulate. Then came an opportunity disguised as chaos. In the late 1950s, the Gallo brothers, a trio of ruthless and unpredictable soldiers within the Prophesy family, began questioning the leadership. They accused Prophesy of greed, of hoarding profits while soldiers risked their lives for scraps. Tensions grew, meetings turned hostile, and whispers of rebellion began spreading through Brooklyn like smoke. Most men chose sides hastily. Joe did not. He observed. He waited. He attended meetings with both camps, careful never to promise too much to either. To Prophesy's loyalists, he was a calm voice of reason, advising patience and loyalty. To those leaning toward the gallows, he was understanding, sympathetic even, assuring them that he saw their frustration. In reality, Joe was neither for nor against anyone. He was for survival. And survival, in times of war, often meant staying invisible until the smoke cleared. This quiet neutrality caught the attention of another powerful man, Joe Magliocco, Prophesy's underboss. Magliocco admired Colombo's restraint and intelligence. He confided in him, seeking his opinion during the family's internal turmoil. Joe listened, offered advice without arrogance, and in doing so, gained something even more valuable than territory, trust from both sides of the leadership. When Prophesie's health began to fail, Magliocco started handling more responsibilities. Colombo became one of his most reliable lieutenants. While others schemed for advancement, Joe played the long game. He continued building legitimate fronts, real estate investments, small businesses, and trucking firms that laundered profits seamlessly. He wanted his money clean, his reputation stable, and his crew disciplined. His men admired him. They said Joe didn't need to raise his hand to command respect. His authority came from his demeanor, the way he carried himself, the quiet confidence that surrounded him. When he spoke, others listened. When he gave orders, they were followed without hesitation. There was no bluster, no ego, just certainty. One story from those years circulated quietly among his crew. A union official once tried to double-cross Joe, withholding funds meant for the family. Instead of sending enforcers, Joe invited the man to dinner. Over a bottle of red wine, he spoke softly about loyalty, about family, about how misunderstandings could destroy good men. By the end of the night, the money was returned, and the man left promising never to betray him again. No threats were needed. Joe's calm presence alone carried the weight of consequence. By the early 1960s, Colombo's reputation had reached the upper echelons of the Commission, the governing council of the American Mafia. He was respected for his intelligence and admired for his discipline. But he was still not a boss, not yet. He had learned the rules of the game, but the next step would require something different: timing, cunning, and the ability to seize opportunity when others were blinded by greed. And that opportunity would soon arrive. When Joe Prophesy died in 1962, the family entered a period of instability. Magliocco assumed leadership, but unrest still lingered, especially from the rebellious Gallo faction. The streets whispered again of betrayal, of shifting loyalties. But this time, Joe Colombo would not stand on the sidelines. He was no longer the cautious observer, he was the man positioned perfectly between factions, trusted by all, underestimated by most. He had earned his button long ago, his formal initiation into the Mafia family sealed with blood and oath. But now, he was playing for something far greater. He had the mind of a strategist, the patience of a soldier, and the quiet ambition of a man who understood that power is not taken in a storm, it is collected in stillness. As the city lights reflected off the East River, Joe would sometimes pause and watch them from his car window. The skyline shimmered like a promise. He had come far from the restless sailor who once defied his commanding officers. Every lesson, every conversation, every calculated silence had led him here. The pieces were in place, the old order was weakening, and the time for waiting was almost over. Soon, Joseph Colombo would no longer be the man serving under another's name. Soon, he would be the name itself, the man at the head of the table, the dawn of his own family. The rise would be quiet, almost seamless, as if the city itself had been preparing for it. But like every rise in the underworld, it would carry a shadow, a price that no one, not even Colombo, could yet see. The tension that had been simmering within the Prophesy family finally erupted like a long-suppressed storm. It was the early 1960s, and New York's underworld was on edge. For years, Joe Prophesy had ruled his family with an iron hand wrapped in a velvet glove. He was a man who demanded loyalty, but his hunger for tribute, the so-called tax he imposed on every soldier and captain, had grown unbearable. His men paid him not just out of duty, but out of fear. Yet fear has an expiration date. In smoky bars and late-night diners across Brooklyn, whispers began to circulate. The Gallo brothers, Larry, Albert, and the fiery, unpredictable Joey, had decided they'd had enough. They called themselves the Young Turks, a new generation unwilling to live under the weight of the old. They were bold, reckless, and dangerous, the kind of men who saw violence not as a last resort, but as a form of expression. Their defiance was intoxicating to the younger soldiers who felt stifled by Prophesy's rigid rule. The streets buzzed with rumors of rebellion. Joe Colombo watched it all unfold from a distance. He was no fool. He understood that in the Mafia, wars are not won by the loudest man, but by the one who knows when to stay silent. He had spent years earning the trust of both Joe Prophesy and Joe Magliocco, and that trust had made him valuable. When others shouted, Joe listened. When others drew guns, he kept his hands in his pockets. The rebellion was dangerous, but within that chaos lay opportunity, the kind of opportunity that could reshape the very structure of power. The Gallo brothers struck first. They kidnapped Joe Magliocco's underboss, Joe Prophesy's right-hand man, and demanded a new arrangement. No more excessive tribute, no more blind obedience. It was a bold move, some said suicidal. The old Don responded as old Dons always did, with vengeance disguised as negotiation. Prophesy agreed to meet, offering peace. The Gallos accepted. They thought they'd won. But the peace was an illusion. Within weeks, several Gallo associates vanished. Bodies began turning up in alleys and car trunks. The streets of Brooklyn ran red again. The Prophesy war had begun. Joe Colombo's world turned cautious. Streets he once walked freely now felt different, too quiet, too watchful. Each corner held eyes that might belong to allies or enemies. He instructed his crew to stay disciplined, to avoid unnecessary movements, to let the hotheads destroy each other. "We'll survive this," he told his men calmly one night over coffee in a dim Italian cafe. "But only if we think like businessmen, not soldiers." That was Joe's philosophy. Power was a business transaction, not an act of revenge. And while bullets flew between the Gallo and Prophesy factions, Colombo's businesses kept running. The unions were still paid, the trucks still moved, and the construction sites under his control still operated on schedule. He made sure to deliver Prophesy's share without delay, even as others defied him. That reliability did not go unnoticed. In time, as the war dragged on and both sides grew weary, Colombo began acting as a quiet intermediary. He reached out to friends in both camps, offering to keep things calm, to prevent misunderstandings. In truth, he was studying both factions, learning who could be trusted and who was likely to fall. The Mafia was Darwinian, survival of the patient. And Joe had patience in abundance. Then, in 1962, Joe Prophesy fell ill. Cancer had begun to weaken the old Don, and whispers of succession filled the air. With his mentor dying and the rebellion still unresolved, Joe Colombo knew that a power vacuum was coming. The question was who would fill it. When Prophesy finally passed away, the family was in disarray. His longtime lieutenant, Joe Magliocco, stepped into the role of boss, but he inherited not peace, only exhaustion and enemies. Magliocco was respected, but not feared. He trusted Joe Colombo deeply, often consulting him for advice on how to stabilize the family. "You've got the head for this," Magliocco told him once during a quiet dinner. "The others fight like wolves. You think like a fox." Joe smiled politely, never revealing the thought running quietly behind his eyes: a fox can outlive wolves if he plays the forest right. But Magliocco made a mistake that would soon define Colombo's destiny. In his desperation to secure his position, he conspired with Joe Bonanno, another powerful boss, to eliminate key members of the Mafia's governing body, the Commission. It was a bold and dangerous plot. The idea was simple: kill the rivals, seize control, and reshape the balance of power. Bonanno, always ambitious, agreed. Magliocco went along. And for the deadly task of arranging the hits, they turned to someone they both trusted, Joe Colombo. Joe listened carefully as Magliocco explained the plan. He didn't interrupt. He didn't react. When the conversation ended, he nodded, said he'd take care of it, and left quietly. But inside, his mind was racing. He knew that assassinating members of the Commission was suicide. The Mafia's unwritten rules were absolute: you do not touch the Commission. Anyone who tried would be erased. So instead of carrying out the order, Joe did something extraordinary. He went directly to the Commission and told them everything. The decision was bold, dangerous, and brilliant. He presented himself not as a traitor, but as a loyalist, a man who refused to betray the sacred order. "I couldn't let them do this," he reportedly said. "It would destroy everything we've built." The commission believed him. They spared his life. Magliocco, however, was summoned, stripped of his title, and quietly forced into retirement. He would die soon after of natural causes. And in a moment of almost cinematic irony, the commission turned to Joe Colombo, the man who had exposed the plot, and offered him the very position once held by his mentor. He was now the head of the family that would bear his name. To outsiders, it looked like a clean transition. There were no public killings, no dramatic power grabs. Just a quiet reshuffling of titles. But those who understood the underworld saw the genius of Colombo's move. He had risen not by violence, but by intellect, not by breaking the rules, but by enforcing them. In a world of men who sought glory through blood, Joe had found his through loyalty, at least on the surface. The Prophesy War ended as quietly as it had begun. The Gallo faction, depleted and fractured, retreated. The commission restored order. And Joe Colombo emerged from the ashes, calm and composed, as though he had merely been waiting for his turn. At his first family meeting as boss, held in a small restaurant in Brooklyn, Joe spoke softly. "From now on," he said, "we keep peace. We keep business clean. We make money, not noise." Those present described the atmosphere as electric, not from fear, but from a sense of relief. After years of chaos, they finally had a leader who understood balance. That night, as Joe drove home, the city outside his window felt different. The lights seemed brighter, the streets quieter. He had outlasted the old guard and survived the war without spilling unnecessary blood. He was now a Don, the head of one of New York's 5 families. And though the world around him still pulsed with danger, he felt, for the first time, entirely in control. But even then, beneath that calm surface, the first cracks of destiny were forming. Power has a way of shifting quietly, like water beneath ice. Joe Colombo had won his throne not by force, but by reason. Yet in the world he ruled, reason was a fragile thing. The city loved peace, but it never forgot chaos. And in the shadows, men were already wondering, how long could this new dawn hold both at once? The coronation of Joe Colombo as boss marked a new chapter not only for his family, but for the entire world of organized crime in New York. It was 1963, and for the first time in decades, there was a sense of uneasy calm within the Mafia's 5 families. The bloody wars of the past had left scars that everyone wanted to forget. The commission needed stability, and Colombo, with his calm temperament and businesslike approach, seemed to be the perfect man for the job. The newspapers didn't report it, of course. To the outside world, Joe Colombo was just another quiet Italian businessman from Brooklyn. But inside the underworld, whispers spread quickly. He had ascended without spilling a drop of blood, without betrayal or chaos. Some called him lucky. Others called him dangerous. The truth lay somewhere in between. Colombo understood that ruling a mafia family was not about fear, it was about balance. Fear could make men obey, but respect could make them loyal. And so, he ruled with a steady hand, preferring conversation over confrontation. Under his leadership, the family, once known as the Prophesy family, began to transform. It wasn't long before everyone simply called it the Colombo family. He reorganized the structure from the ground up. Gone were the constant power struggles that had defined the Prophesy era. Colombo appointed trusted men to key positions, often those who shared his preference for business over violence. He encouraged legitimate front operations, construction companies, unions, shipping firms, and small businesses that could blend seamlessly with the city's economic fabric. "Make it look clean," he told his captains. "The cleaner it looks, the safer it is." Still, his leadership did not come without its tests. The Gallo brothers, though weakened, had not disappeared. Joey Gallo, recently released from prison, remained defiant and unpredictable. From his perspective, Colombo's peaceful takeover was nothing but another betrayal, another old-school boss pretending to bring order. While hoarding power, he vowed revenge. The feud would simmer beneath the surface for years, waiting for its moment to boil over again. But for now, Colombo was focused on something bigger than street fights. He had an idea, a vision that went beyond the traditional world of organized crime. Where others saw secrecy, he saw opportunity. While most mob bosses preferred to hide from the public eye, Joe Colombo began stepping toward it. It started subtly. He gave quiet donations to local Italian-American organizations. He spoke about pride, heritage, and respect for the Italian-American community. He noticed how often Italians were portrayed as criminals in movies and television, how the word mafia had become shorthand for their entire culture. This bothered him, deeply. Perhaps it was ego, perhaps it was genuine conviction, but Colombo began to believe he could change that image. He was, after all, a man who had risen through intellect and diplomacy. Why not extend that diplomacy beyond the underworld? Why not become a voice, even a defender, for his people? In 1970, this idea would evolve into something far larger, but even in these early years, the seeds were being planted. Colombo began quietly building connections with legitimate businessmen, lawyers, and even community leaders. He wanted to be seen not as a gangster, but as a pillar, a man who cared about justice for his people. Behind closed doors, however, the business of crime continued as usual. The Colombo family grew stronger than ever. The unions were loyal, the rackets profitable, and the money flowed steadily. Joe's calm, methodical approach meant fewer arrests and fewer internal disputes. His family became the most stable of the five. At night, when the city lights shimmered on the East River, Colombo would sometimes sit in his car and reflect on how far he'd come. From a furniture delivery man to the head of a mafia empire, it was a journey that even Hollywood couldn't have written better. Yet beneath the calm, a quiet restlessness stirred in him. Power, once tasted, is never enough. He began to dream bigger. He told his closest associates that the future of organized crime wasn't in violence or street-level rackets, it was in legitimacy. He encouraged his men to invest in real estate, construction, even stock markets. The government will always chase the crooks, he said once during a private dinner, but they don't know what to do with businessmen. And yet, while Colombo's vision expanded, so too did his ego. The newspapers began to take notice of his name, first in whispers, then in print. Law enforcement agencies, too, were watching. The FBI had long been frustrated by their inability to crack the mafia's inner circle. Colombo's growing prominence gave them a new target, a name they could pin to the mysterious sixth family of rumor, the one no one had dared to define. The Bureau began to surveil his meetings, track his union connections, and intercept phone calls. Colombo, of course, knew this. He had informants everywhere, including inside law enforcement. Let them listen, he said once with a shrug. They'll hear nothing but good business. Still, he moved cautiously. Every step was calculated, every meeting controlled. His ability to stay one step ahead of the FBI became legendary. He maintained an outward appearance of legitimacy, always dressed impeccably, always speaking calmly, and never raising his voice. He presented himself as a community leader, not a criminal. But those who knew him best could sense the change. His early humility, that quiet patience that had once defined him, began to fade. He was spending more time with legitimate businessmen, journalists, and even politicians. He enjoyed the attention, the feeling of being admired not as a mobster but as a public figure. At home, his family saw the transformation too. He was still a devoted father and husband, but his mind was often elsewhere, lost in thoughts of influence and recognition. "You're not just a boss anymore," one of his sons reportedly told him. "You're becoming famous." Fame, it was a dangerous word in the world Joe Colombo inhabited. Most mobsters feared it, understanding that attention attracted law enforcement, betrayal, and death. But for Colombo, fame was becoming a tool. He would use it not to hide from the system, but to confront it. He was tired of Italians being stereotyped as gangsters. He was tired of seeing his culture vilified. He wanted to fight back, not with bullets, but with speeches, marches, and headlines. This was unheard of in Mafia history. No boss had ever courted the media, let alone become a public figure. But Joe Colombo wasn't like other bosses. He believed he could control the narrative, that he could exist in two worlds at once, the shadowy empire of organized crime and the bright lights of public advocacy. It was a balancing act as dangerous as walking a tightrope above fire. One misstep could mean ruin. But Colombo was confident, perhaps too confident. He believed that he could outsmart both the FBI and the Commission, that his charm and intellect could shield him from consequences. And for a while, it seemed to work. His businesses thrived, his family was united, and his name began appearing in the papers not as a suspect, but as a spokesman. Yet even as Joe Colombo's world appeared to expand, it was also beginning to tilt. Power, fame, and principle, they do not coexist easily, especially in the world of crime. The same ambition that had lifted him from the shadows was now leading him toward the spotlight. In quiet moments, when he sat alone in his Brooklyn home, he sometimes thought about the old days, the silence of backrooms, the simple rules of loyalty and secrecy. Those rules had built his empire. But now, he was writing new ones. And as history would later show, the moment Joe Colombo decided to step into the light, his fate was sealed. He just didn't know it yet. It was the late 1960s, and America was in a state of transformation. The streets echoed with protests, civil rights marches, and calls for equality. Across the country, people were demanding to be heard, Black Americans, women, students, immigrants, each fighting for their piece of dignity and justice. Amid this chorus of voices, one unexpected figure was about to step onto the stage, a man no one would have imagined joining the era's parade of activism, Joseph Colombo, head of one of New York's 5 families. The spark came from what seemed at first like a small injustice. One of Colombo's sons, Joseph Jr., had been arrested by the FBI on charges of conspiracy and perjury, accusations that Colombo believed were fabricated, a way to harass his family. To Joe, this wasn't just a legal case, it was a personal attack. But more than that, he began to see it as an insult to all Italian Americans who were constantly stereotyped as gangsters and criminals. He watched as the media headlines casually linked his heritage to organized crime, as if being Italian automatically meant being part of the Mafia. That narrative had haunted his community for decades. Colombo had built his power in the shadows, but this was about identity, respect, and pride. So he decided to fight back, not with guns, but with words. In 1970, Joe Colombo founded the Italian-American Civil Rights League, an organization that, at least on paper, had a noble mission, to end the discrimination and negative portrayal of Italian Americans in the media, government, and law enforcement. The League called for fair treatment, cultural pride, and community unity. It spoke of heritage and justice. But behind the scenes, it was also Colombo's masterstroke, a clever shield against law enforcement scrutiny, a stage from which he could control the public narrative. His timing was perfect. America was listening to activists, to voices of defiance and dignity. And when Joe Colombo stepped forward, dressed sharply, speaking calmly and eloquently, people listened. The man had presence. He wasn't shouting or waving fists. He was persuasive, measured, even charismatic. "We are not all criminals," he said during one of his early speeches. "We are hard-working Americans who love this country as much as anyone." Crowds began to grow. What started as a small group of supporters meeting in Brooklyn soon became a movement. Within months, thousands of Italian Americans were marching under the banner of the Italian American Civil Rights League, chanting slogans of unity and pride. They carried flags, sang songs, and demanded respect. The public loved it. The media, hungry for colorful stories during a time of social unrest, covered Colombo's rallies with fascination. Here was a mafia boss, though they never called him that outright, reinventing himself as a civil rights leader. It was the kind of paradox that made headlines. And Colombo leaned into it. He granted interviews, spoke on television, and even appeared at charity events. He invited celebrities, politicians, and community leaders to join his cause. The League's slogan, "Equal Rights for Italian Americans," echoed across New York. Donations poured in. Membership grew into the tens of thousands. It was, on the surface, a cultural awakening. Behind the scenes, however, Colombo's closest associates watched with a mix of awe and concern. His captains murmured in private, wondering if their boss had gone too far. The more cameras, the more problems, one warned. But Joe was undeterred. He had tasted something intoxicating: legitimacy. For the first time, he wasn't just feared, he was admired. The League gave him something no mafia title could: applause. And he loved it. By the summer of 1970, Colombo's movement had become too large to ignore. Newspapers described him as a leader for his people. Television stations filmed his marches, and ordinary citizens, plumbers, bakers, shopkeepers, began to see him as a symbol of pride. For decades, Italians had lived under the shadow of prejudice and stereotype. Now, here was one of their own standing up to the government and winning. Even politicians began to take notice. Some attended his events, smiling for the cameras, eager to connect with a growing voter base. Colombo, ever the strategist, used these relationships to his advantage. He saw the League as more than a social movement, it was political leverage. The more influence he gained, the harder it would be for the FBI to target him openly. After all, how could the government move against a man leading peaceful marches for equality? But not everyone in his world was celebrating. The other mafia bosses, the heads of the Genovese, Gambino, Lucchese, and Bonanno families, watched Colombo's rise with growing unease. To them, his public activism was reckless. The mafia's strength had always depended on secrecy, on keeping business away from the light. Colombo's crusade threatened that balance. He was putting a spotlight on the very world they had spent generations hiding. Carlo Gambino, in particular, was deeply troubled. The quiet, calculating head of the Gambino family had built his empire by staying invisible. To see Colombo parading on television, shaking hands with reporters and politicians, felt like a betrayal of everything the mafia stood for. "He's making a circus of the commission," Gambino reportedly muttered during one meeting. "He's turning us into clowns." Still, Colombo ignored the warnings. The public adored him, and the League continued to grow. At its peak, the organization claimed more than 100,000 members nationwide. Colombo began organizing massive rallies, drawing tens of thousands to New York streets. The FBI tried to downplay the movement, but the scale was undeniable. In one of his proudest moments, Joe stood before a sea of supporters in Columbus Circle, Manhattan, their chants echoing through the skyscrapers. He smiled as he looked out at the crowd. The man who had once operated in whispers now stood surrounded by cheers. "We are not Mafia," he declared into the microphone. "We are Americans, and we demand respect." The applause was thunderous. The crowd erupted with chants of "Colombo! Colombo!" And for a brief, shining moment, he was not a gangster, he was a hero. But beneath the applause, danger was gathering like a dark tide. The FBI was furious. They saw the League not as a civil rights movement, but as a mafia front, a way for Colombo to strengthen his influence and obstruct investigations. Agents began infiltrating the organization, attending rallies, recording phone calls, building dossiers. The Bureau wanted him silenced, one way or another. Meanwhile, within the underworld, resentment was growing. The commission had tolerated Colombo's antics for a while, but his name was now in the newspapers almost daily. He was bringing too much heat, too much attention. Rumors began to circulate that some bosses wanted him warned, or worse. Still, Joe couldn't stop. He believed he was untouchable now, protected by fame, by community, by the righteousness of his cause. His rallies were growing larger, and plans were already underway for the biggest one yet, a massive gathering in Columbus Circle, New York, set for the summer of 1971. It would celebrate Italian pride and show the world the strength of his movement. He couldn't have known that it would also mark the beginning of his downfall. For now, Joe Colombo was a man at the height of his power, a mob boss turned celebrity, a criminal turned activist. The world had never seen anything like him. His name was spoken with admiration by some, disgust by others. He stood at the crossroads of history, half in the light, half in the dark, convinced that he could walk both worlds forever. But the spotlight that had once made him feel invincible was slowly beginning to burn. And soon, that light would expose not just his message, but his mortality. The morning of June 28, 1971, dawned bright and clear over Manhattan, the kind of early summer day that made the city feel alive, pulsing with light and possibility. The air shimmered above the pavement, carrying the scent of street vendors and car exhaust, and from blocks away, one could already hear the hum of voices gathering in Columbus Circle. Flags fluttered in the breeze, and thousands of Italian Americans, dressed in their Sunday best, filled the plaza in a sea of red, white, and green. It was the Italian American Civil Rights League's second annual rally, and Joe Colombo was its star attraction. Reporters had gathered from every major newspaper and television network, their cameras gleaming under the sun. For weeks, Colombo had promoted this event as the grand celebration of unity, a demonstration that his people were proud, dignified, and unafraid of prejudice. To many, it was a day of joy. To others, especially those in the shadows of organized crime, it was a day heavy with tension. By this point, Colombo's public image had taken on almost mythic proportions. To the ordinary people who adored him, he was a hero, a man who stood up to the government, who gave voice to the working-class Italian families of New York. But to the FBI and the other Mafia bosses, he was a problem that needed to be solved. His visibility had become dangerous. The Mafia thrived on silence, and Colombo's rallies were anything but silent. He had crossed a line that few before him had dared to even approach. Still, Joe felt unstoppable that morning. He arrived at the rally in style, his dark suit crisp, his hair neatly combed, his smile calm and confident. He was surrounded by bodyguards, league members, and supporters waving flags and banners that read, "Equal rights for Italian Americans." Television crews jockeyed for position, eager to capture his speech. It was meant to be a day of triumph. It would instead become one of the most shocking moments in Mafia history. Around 12:20 p.m., just as Colombo was about to take the stage, a man pushed through the crowd. He was carrying a camera, at least, that's what it looked like. He seemed calm, blending in among the journalists. Some accounts say he even smiled. His name was Jerome Johnson, a young black man who claimed to be a freelance photographer. No one knew who he really was or what he intended. Then, in an instant, everything changed. Johnson walked directly up to Colombo, so close that the mob boss could see his reflection in the camera lens, and pulled out a concealed pistol. 3 shots rang out, echoing across Columbus Circle. The crowd froze. Colombo fell backward, a look of shock frozen on his face as the world around him erupted into chaos. Panic spread like wildfire. People screamed, ducked, and ran. Banners fell to the ground. Within seconds, Colombo's bodyguards reacted. One of them drew his own gun and fired at Johnson, hitting him multiple times. Johnson collapsed beside the stage, blood pooling beneath him. He died instantly. Colombo, however, was still alive, barely. The bullets had struck him in the head and neck. He was rushed to Roosevelt Hospital, sirens wailing through the crowded streets of Manhattan, while news reporters shouted into cameras, trying to make sense of the mayhem. Within an hour, the story was everywhere. The man who had turned a mafia family into a movement now lay near death. At the hospital, doctors fought desperately to save him. They performed emergency surgery, removing bullet fragments and stabilizing his breathing. Against all odds, Joe Colombo survived. But he never regained consciousness. The bullets had done irreversible damage to his brain, leaving him in a deep coma from which he would never awaken. He was just 48 years old. The reaction from the underworld was immediate, and divided. Some bosses expressed quiet relief. The commission, many suspected, had grown tired of his grandstanding. Colombo's activism had drawn too much attention to the Mafia, threatening to expose its operations. The assassination attempt, though shocking, seemed almost inevitable. Others, however, were outraged. They saw the attack as sacrilege, a hit carried out in broad daylight, in front of thousands of civilians, during a public event. It was a violation of every code, every rule. The question on everyone's lips was the same: who ordered it? The police investigation was swift but inconclusive. Jerome Johnson, the gunman, had been killed before he could speak. No one knew if he acted alone or if someone had sent him. Theories spread like wildfire. Some believed it was the FBI, desperate to silence Colombo's growing influence. Others whispered that the Gallo brothers, particularly Joey Gallo, had arranged it, a revenge strike against the man they blamed for their downfall. A few even suspected that Colombo's own allies had turned on him, eager to reclaim control of the family before his activism brought ruin upon them all. The truth was never proven. Johnson's background was murky. He had no known mafia ties, but there were strange connections. He had reportedly been seen meeting with certain underworld figures in the days before the shooting. And then there was the fact that Joey Gallo had recently been released from prison, strutting through Brooklyn like a man reborn, eager to reclaim his lost power. Many put two and two together. For the FBI, the chaos was both a tragedy and an opportunity. The League, once a powerful movement, began to crumble almost overnight. Without its charismatic leader, it lost its direction. Donations stopped. Rallies were cancelled. The organization that had once filled Columbus Circle with hope and pride dissolved into silence. Joe Colombo's empire, too, began to fracture. With their boss incapacitated, his lieutenants fought quietly for control. Some remained loyal, managing his business interests on behalf of his family. Others saw an opening for power. The Colombo family, once the most stable of New York's five, descended into uncertainty. At Roosevelt Hospital, Colombo lay motionless in a private room. Guards stood outside his door, ensuring his safety, though from whom, no one could say. Visitors came and went, speaking to him softly, though he never responded. His wife and children stayed by his side, their lives changed forever. Outside, in the streets, the whispers continued. Was this the end of the League? The end of Colombo's dream? Or was it just another turn in the endless cycle of rise and fall that defined the Mafia world? Even as he lay unconscious, Joe Colombo's presence lingered. His movement had touched thousands. His defiance had inspired admiration and fear in equal measure. And now, his near death had become a symbol, of ambition, of pride, and of the peril that comes from stepping too far into the light. Weeks passed. The rallies stopped. The newspapers moved on. But within the underworld, the ripple effects of that day would last for years. The delicate balance of power among the five families shifted once more. The Gallo faction, emboldened by Colombo's absence, began to stir again, leading to another round of bloodshed in the streets. Joe Colombo never recovered. For 7 long years, he remained in a coma, tended to by his family in their Long Island home. His once sharp mind, the strategist who had outmaneuvered rivals, charmed the press, and challenged the government, was gone. Yet his story was far from over. Even in his silence, Joe Colombo had left an indelible mark on history. He had shown the world a different kind of mob boss, one who sought fame, who dared to mix crime with cause, who believed he could outthink both the Mafia and America itself. And as the sun set on that violent day in 1971, one truth became clear: in the world Joe Colombo had ruled, no light burned forever without casting shadows. His rise had been dazzling. His fall was both tragic and inevitable, the final act of a man who had dared to stand in two worlds, and found himself consumed by both. The sound of gunfire at Columbus Circle did more than end Joe Colombo's public life, it sent a shockwave through the underworld that would echo for years. The news spread across the city like wildfire. Within hours, every bar, restaurant, and social club in Brooklyn and Little Italy was buzzing with disbelief. A Mafia boss, shot in front of thousands, live on television, it was something no one had ever seen before. The old rules had been shattered. That night, as the city lights flickered across the Hudson, whispers of vengeance filled the air. The Colombo family, leaderless and shaken, began to splinter. Men who had once walked tall now moved cautiously, glancing over their shoulders, unsure of who to trust. The commission, the shadowy council that governed the five families, met in secret to discuss what to do next. Colombo had become a problem even in his coma. He was alive, yes, but no longer capable of leadership. And as long as he lived, his name would still carry weight and danger. In those early days after the shooting, there were two wars taking shape, one in the streets, and one in the shadows. On the streets, Joey Gallo was making his move. He had been released from prison only months before the shooting and was determined to reclaim his place in Brooklyn's criminal world. To Gallo, the attack on Colombo was an opportunity, a message from fate. The man who had once humiliated him was now lying helpless in a hospital bed, and the throne was empty. Rumors swirled that Gallo had orchestrated the shooting, using an outsider like Jerome Johnson as a pawn to avoid direct suspicion. The police never proved it, but the streets believed it. Crazy Joe did it, men whispered in back rooms and corner diners. He wanted to send a message. Whether true or not, the label stuck, and Colombo loyalists began to plot their revenge. Meanwhile, in the shadows, the other bosses, Carlo Gambino, Thomas Lucchese, Vito Genovese's successors, and the remnants of Joe Bonanno's crew, discussed Colombo's future in quiet, cautious tones. They respected what he had built, but they could not afford his chaos. His public activism, his defiance of secrecy, had nearly brought too much heat down on all of them. The FBI was watching everything now. Colombo's Civil Rights League had drawn cameras, agents, and investigations into corners that had once been invisible. The commission decided that his family had to be contained. But who would lead them? There was Joseph, Joey Iacovelli, a longtime Colombo lieutenant with a reputation for discretion and intelligence. There was also Carmine, the snake, Persico, a younger and more ambitious figure who had been close to Colombo before the shooting. Persico had a reputation as both a thinker and a killer, dangerous, but capable. For a time, Iacovelli acted as caretaker boss, keeping the family's operations steady while Colombo's condition remained unchanged. But it was Persico, moving quietly behind the scenes, who was already maneuvering for long-term control. He saw himself as Colombo's true successor, the one who could rebuild what had been broken. While these internal struggles brewed, Joe Colombo remained trapped in his coma, breathing but silent. His family turned their home on Long Island into a kind of private hospital, hiring nurses and security to care for him. His wife, Lucille, sat beside his bed for hours each day, speaking softly to him, hoping for a flicker of recognition. But Joe never opened his eyes. Outside, the league that had once carried his name crumbled. Without Colombo's charisma, the Italian-American Civil Rights League fractured into factions. Some members tried to continue his message of cultural pride, but most drifted away. The FBI, seeing its chance, moved aggressively. Investigations into the League's finances revealed money laundering, racketeering, and ties to organized crime. Within months, the League's offices were raided, its funds seized, and its reputation destroyed. The movement that had begun as a symbol of pride had ended in disgrace. But the story didn't end there. In early 1972, a year after the shooting, New York saw a resurgence of gangland violence. Drive-by shootings, car bombings, and disappearances became nightly news. It was the beginning of what would come to be known as the Second Colombo War, a bloody internal feud between loyalists of the old Colombo regime and those aligned with Joey Gallo. On April 7, 1972, as the city celebrated Joey Gallo's 43rd birthday, fate came for him. He was at Umberto's Clam House in Little Italy, enjoying dinner with his family, laughing, drinking wine, perhaps feeling invincible again. Around 4:30 a.m., gunmen burst through the door. They fired multiple shots. Gallo was hit 5 times. He stumbled into the street, bleeding, collapsing beneath the neon lights of Mulberry Street. By dawn, he was dead. The streets whispered again, Colombo's revenge. No one was ever convicted for Gallo's murder, but everyone believed it was payback. The old family had struck back to restore its honor. Even as Colombo lay motionless in his hospital bed, his name still carried enough power to make men kill. His legacy had become a ghost that haunted everyone who had crossed him. After Gallo's death, the violence began to cool. The commission stepped in, reasserting control. They needed stability, not chaos. The FBI pressure was relentless, every shooting brought more agents, more investigations. It was agreed that Carmine Persico would officially take over the family, bringing a new era of leadership. Persico was shrewd. He understood that Colombo's name still carried respect among the rank and file, so he kept it. The family would remain the Colombo family, a tribute to the man who had once led it with vision and charisma, and whose tragic fall had made him a legend. But even as new leaders rose and the underworld tried to move on, Colombo's story refused to fade. The newspapers still covered updates on his condition. Once a month, there would be a quiet report, Colombo still in coma. His name continued to appear in court documents, FBI files, and whispered conversations in social clubs. The world outside changed. The Mafia's influence began to wane as law enforcement became more sophisticated, as new technologies, wiretaps, surveillance, informants, penetrated even the most secretive circles. The city that had once belonged to men like Colombo was evolving into something else, cleaner on the surface, but colder, less personal. And through it all, Joe Colombo remained where he was, frozen between life and death, between legend and oblivion. In the years that followed, he became more than a man, he became a myth. To some, he was a martyr, a symbol of Italian-American pride silenced by the system. To others, he was a cautionary tale, a mobster who flew too close to the sun, blinded by ambition and ego. But those who had known him personally, men who'd sat across from him in smoky rooms, who'd listened to his calm voice deliver orders and wisdom, remembered something more complex. They remembered a man of contradictions, ruthless yet disciplined, idealistic yet calculating, a gangster who wanted to be loved. And as the decade wore on, one truth lingered in the minds of all who had lived through his rise and fall: Joe Colombo had changed the Mafia forever. He had broken the silence, stepped into the light, and paid the ultimate price. By the mid-1970s, the Colombo family had moved on under Persico's iron rule, and the rest of New York's underworld settled back into its uneasy peace. Yet, every so often, when old-timers gathered late at night in quiet Brooklyn bars, someone would raise a glass and say softly, "To Joe." And for a brief moment, they would remember the man who had tried to be both Don and Dreamer, the mob boss who had dared to believe he could turn a criminal empire into a cause. Outside, the city continued to change. New skyscrapers rose, old neighborhoods disappeared, and time washed away the traces of that violent, glittering age. But the name Joe Colombo lingered like a ghost in the history of New York, a reminder that in the Mafia, as in life, the brightest lights often burn the shortest. By the mid-1970s, New York had changed, the city Joe Colombo had once ruled now moved to a different rhythm. The neon lights still glowed, the avenues still buzzed with life, but the old-world elegance of the Mafia's golden age had begun to fade. The five families, still powerful, were learning to survive in a world that no longer feared them as it once did. And somewhere on Long Island, in a quiet house surrounded by trimmed hedges and silence, Joe Colombo remained suspended between life and death. He had been in a coma for over 3 years now. His breathing was steady but shallow, his eyes closed, his body thin from the endless stillness. Nurses moved quietly through the house at all hours, tending to him with clinical precision. His wife, Lucille, stayed by his side every day. She would sit by his bed, hold his hand, and read softly from the newspaper, updates about their children, about the world outside, about the men who now ran the organization that had once been his. His sons, Joseph Jr., Christopher, and Anthony, were growing into men of their own, but the burden of their father's legacy weighed on them. They had to live in the long shadow of a man both celebrated and condemned. Every headline, every whisper, still linked them to him. The Colombo name was both shield and curse. While Joe lay silent, the world around him kept moving. The Italian-American Civil Rights League, once a powerful voice, had completely disintegrated. Its offices were closed, its funds frozen. The FBI's investigations into its finances had revealed layers of corruption, though no one could ever fully separate truth from exaggeration. Without Joe's charisma, without his voice, the League's heart had stopped beating. But in the streets, among the older generation of Italian Americans, his memory lingered. Some still believed Joe had been a genuine activist, a man who had tried to stand up against unfair stereotypes and government overreach. They remembered the rallies, the pride, the music, and the feeling of unity that had briefly brought dignity to a community long viewed through the lens of suspicion. Others, especially within law enforcement, saw things differently. To them, Colombo had been a manipulator, a man who used activism as camouflage for power. They pointed to the evidence, to the money trails, to the whispers of intimidation and corruption behind the scenes. To them, his fall had been justice served by fate. And yet, in both views, hero and villain, there was something undeniably human about him. He was the contradiction that defined the Mafia itself, part criminal, part philosopher, part family man, part myth. Meanwhile, inside the Colombo family, Carmine, the snake, Persico was consolidating control. Persico, sharp-minded and calculating, knew how to play the long game. He understood the old traditions but adapted to the new world. The narcotics trade was expanding, real estate and construction rackets were booming, and labor unions, always the Mafia's hidden empire, were still ripe for profit. But the shadow of Joe Colombo still loomed large. Persico kept the family name out of respect, but he also knew that completely erasing Colombo's legacy would anger the loyalists who still viewed him as a martyr. So, the Colombo family remained the Colombo family, a monument to the fallen boss who had dared to walk in the daylight. Yet loyalty is fragile in the underworld. As the years passed, quiet resentment began to stir among Colombo's old followers. Some believed Persico had betrayed Joe, that he had been too quick to take power, too eager to move on. Others felt he was steering the family in a dangerous direction. In smoky backrooms and private bars, the debates never stopped. Was Colombo's activism his greatest achievement or his fatal mistake? Had he been set up by his own people, or was the gunman truly an outsider manipulated by hidden forces? No one ever found answers. But what everyone agreed on was this: after Joe Colombo, the Mafia was never the same. He had broken the sacred rule of invisibility, the rule that said a true boss must operate in shadows, never in the light. His defiance had brought both admiration and destruction, and the bosses who followed him learned a lesson that would shape their every move for decades to come: fame and power could never coexist safely in their world. Outside the underworld, the public memory of Joe Colombo took on new forms. Books began to mention him, some admiringly, others critically. Journalists wrote retrospectives, trying to make sense of the man who had turned organized crime into a political cause. In documentaries and late-night talk shows, Colombo's rallies were replayed, footage of him standing at a podium, smiling proudly, his voice calm yet commanding. People would watch and wonder, was he a mobster masquerading as an activist, or an activist trapped by the life he could never escape? For Lucille and the Colombo children, the attention was both comforting and painful. They clung to the image of Joe the husband, Joe the father, not Joe the boss. In private, they prayed for a miracle. Doctors said his condition was stable, but his chances of waking were slim. Still, they never gave up hope. Every so often, there would be a flicker, a slight movement of his fingers, a change in his breathing. The family would hold their breath, waiting for a sign that Joe was returning to them. But the moments always passed, leaving the same quiet stillness behind. Outside, the Mafia continued to evolve. The 1970s gave way to the 1980s, a decade of wiretaps, trials, and betrayals. The government launched a new kind of war, one waged not with bullets, but with indictments. The RICO Act had changed everything, allowing prosecutors to target entire organizations rather than individual crimes. The FBI's Organized Crime Task Force grew stronger each year, slowly unraveling the networks that men like Colombo had built. By the time 1980 arrived, the Mafia's golden era was over. The city's neighborhoods had changed, and so had its values. Where Colombo had once seen opportunity and loyalty, new faces now saw only greed and survival. And yet, in a quiet room on Long Island, Joe Colombo remained, unchanged, unmoved, a living ghost of that vanished age. His life was frozen, but his legend kept moving, reshaped by each new telling. Some said he was cursed by his own ambition. Others said he had been betrayed by the very system he tried to outwit. But those who spoke of him with a touch of reverence, with that knowing tone that only old-timers had, said something different. They said Joe Colombo was ahead of his time, a man who had seen that power, in the modern world, came not from fear, but from influence. And perhaps, in some small way, he had been right. Because even as his body remained silent, his story lived on, in whispers, in books, in the bloodlines of those who carried his name. He had become more than a man. He was an idea, a symbol of the uneasy marriage between crime and conscience, between legacy and ambition. The house grew quieter as the years passed. The nurses changed. The children grew up and moved away. But every day, without fail, Lucille would sit beside him, brush a hand through his hair, and whisper, "We're still here, Joe." Outside the window, the world continued to move, but for Joe Colombo, time had stopped long ago. And yet, in that stillness, his story refused to die. By the early 1980s, time had become a strange companion to the Colombo family. The world outside their quiet Long Island home had transformed completely. The skyline of Manhattan shimmered with new glass towers, the music had changed, the cars, the people, even the rhythm of the city itself. But inside that home, nothing ever changed. Joe Colombo still lay in his bed, motionless, eyes closed, the soft hum of machines filling the air like a lullaby that never ended. Every morning, Lucille Colombo would open the curtains to let in the sunlight. She would talk to him as if he could hear her, updating him about their sons, about the neighborhood, about the old friends who still called to ask how he was doing. Sometimes she would play music, old Italian ballads he used to love, hoping that something familiar might stir him. But he never moved. The doctor said his condition was stable. It was a cruel word, not dying, not living. Just existing. For the men who had once called him boss, Joe Colombo's continued survival was both unsettling and strangely symbolic. It was as if the old world of the Mafia refused to die, even as the new world tried to bury it. The five families were facing a crisis like never before. The FBI had changed the rules of the game. With new surveillance methods, informants, and the powerful RICO Act, the federal government could now dismantle entire crime families from the top down. Carmine, the snake, Persico, who had by then solidified his control of the Colombo family, was one of the most targeted men in the country. Persico, cunning and adaptable, had managed to keep the organization alive, but the pressure was relentless. Federal agents bugged social clubs, tapped phones, and flipped insiders. The old code of silence, the sacred omerta, was breaking apart. And yet, despite all this, the family still bore the name Colombo. Persico had kept it, both out of respect and strategy. Joe Colombo's name had become part of New York's mythology, a brand that carried both power and fear. Even in his coma, Joe's shadow hung over the city. Reporters occasionally revisited his story. Every few years, an article would appear in the New York Times or the Daily News, Colombo still alive after 10 years in coma. The articles would describe his quiet existence, his wife's devotion, his family's resilience. To the public, the story was both tragic and strangely romantic, the mob boss who became a martyr, the man who challenged power and was struck down for it. But within the underworld, the sentiment was more complicated. To some old-timers, Colombo's story was a warning, proof of what happened when a man forgot the rule of silence. They spoke of him with a mix of admiration and pity. He had reached too high, wanted too much. He had believed he could be both a mafia boss and a public crusader. In their world, that was like walking into a hurricane and expecting to stay dry. To others, though, he was still a symbol of pride. They remembered the rallies, the crowds chanting his name, the sense of unity he had created among Italian Americans who had long been stereotyped as criminals. In a strange way, Colombo had done something no one else had. He had given a public voice to a community that had always been told to stay silent. Still, his own family carried the heaviest burden. Joe Jr. tried to step into his father's world but quickly realized the game had changed. The FBI watched every move the Colombo sons made, expecting them to follow in Joe's footsteps. But they were living in an era where being connected to the mob was no longer a badge of honor, it was a sentence. The arrests were constant, the betrayals more frequent, and the glamour that had once surrounded organized crime was fading fast. The younger generation, the children of men like Colombo, Gotti, and Persico, were beginning to see the Mafia for what it truly was, not an empire of respect, but a cycle of pain and loss. For the Colombo family itself, the 1980s brought both fortune and disaster. Under Persico's command, they managed to maintain control over lucrative rackets, construction, labor unions, loan sharking, but the law was closing in. Persico's nickname, the Snake, had been earned for a reason. He was cunning, elusive, and ruthless. Yet even he couldn't escape the growing reach of federal power. In 1985, a historic moment arrived, the Commission case, one of the largest mafia trials in American history. The government had indicted the heads of New York's 5 families under the RICO statute, accusing them of running a nationwide criminal enterprise. Persico, despite being the youngest of the bosses, was among those charged. In a twist of fate, the commission case that sought to dismantle the Mafia forever still carried the name Colombo in its documents. The family that Joe had built, the family that bore his name, was now a central target in the government's crusade against organized crime. Persico decided to represent himself in court, a decision that mirrored Joe's old defiance. He sat in the courtroom wearing a tailored suit, his hair slicked back, speaking calmly to the jury. It was almost as if the ghost of Colombo stood behind him, whispering, "Never show fear." But the outcome was inevitable. The era of invincible mob bosses was over. The commission case resulted in long sentences for many of the most powerful men in the Mafia. Persico himself was sentenced to 139 years in prison. By then, Joe Colombo had been in a coma for more than 14 years. The world he had known was gone. His rivals were dead or imprisoned, the League was forgotten, and the Mafia's grip on New York had weakened beyond recognition. Yet Joe remained, silent and unmoving, like a monument to a time when gangsters believed they could shape history. At night, Lucille would sit by his bedside and look at the framed photos on the dresser, Joe at a rally, smiling in front of the league's banner, Joe with their children at Coney Island, Joe shaking hands with community leaders. In those photographs, he looked so alive, so certain of his place in the world. Now, his body was frail, his hair gray, his face pale and still. Sometimes she would wonder, if he could see what had become of it all, what would he think? Would he regret standing in the spotlight? Would he have chosen a quieter life? Or would he still believe that his cause had meaning, even in the ruin it left behind? No one could answer. What was certain, however, was that Joe Colombo's name had transcended his life. He was no longer just a man, he was a story. A myth that older men told in hushed tones, a legend that filmmakers borrowed from, a ghost that still haunted the foundations of New York's underworld. And as the 1980s drew to a close, the world that had once belonged to him faded into memory. Yet, in that quiet Long Island home, amid the sound of steady breathing and the slow ticking of a wall clock, Joe Colombo remained. A relic of a vanished age. A king without a kingdom. A voice forever silenced, but never forgotten. The world had moved on. But his shadow lingered. By the dawn of the 1990s, nearly 2 decades had passed since that fateful day in Columbus Circle, the day when the crack of gunfire had ended Joe Colombo's life as the world knew it. The city that once pulsed with his influence had transformed into something unrecognizable. Skyscrapers gleamed higher, the streets buzzed with a new kind of energy, and the underworld that Joe once ruled had fractured into pieces, its golden age long gone. Yet, even as time marched on, the legend of Joe Colombo refused to fade. His name lingered in documentaries, whispered conversations, and the dusty pages of true crime books. To some, he was a tragic hero, the mob boss who stood up for his people and paid the price. To others, he was a cautionary tale, a man undone by vanity, blinded by the spotlight he couldn't resist. But to those who had truly known him, who had once sat across the table from him, cigar smoke curling between them, Joe Colombo was something more complex, a man of vision and contradiction. And still, in that quiet house on Long Island, he remained alive, if such a word could still apply. The world around him had changed beyond measure. The Mafia was no longer the secret empire it had once been. The RICO Act, which had been the government's most powerful weapon, had done its work. The 5 families were no longer untouchable. Bosses who had once walked freely in silk suits were now confined to concrete cells, serving life sentences handed down by judges who had grown weary of the myth of organized crime. John Gotti, the flashy boss of the Gambino family, had become the new face of the Mafia during the 1980s, the Teflon Don, a media darling whose charm and arrogance echoed the same charisma Joe Colombo once carried. But even Gotti's reign had ended in prison, proving once more that fame and the Mafia could not coexist without consequence. In many ways, Gotti's story was a reflection of Colombo's, played out in a different decade. Both men had courted the cameras, both had defied the traditions of silence, and both had been consumed by their own myth. It was as if history had repeated itself, a cycle the Mafia could never seem to escape. By 1992, Joe Colombo had been in a coma for 21 years. His condition was unchanged. His family had aged around him, his wife now gray-haired, his sons middle-aged men, their own children growing up without truly knowing their grandfather. Yet, they still called him Daddy, still spoke to him as if he could hear. The devotion of his family had become a quiet miracle, a testament to the bond that even the darkest world could not destroy. Lucille Colombo, fragile but determined, continued her daily ritual. Every morning she would open the curtains, talk to him, tell him stories of their children and grandchildren. She would play recordings of Italian songs from the 1960s, the same melodies that once played at league rallies, when Joe stood tall and proud before crowds that adored him. In the stillness of that room, the echoes of those days seemed to linger, the chants, the applause, the flashes of cameras. But now they lived only in memory. The Mafia, meanwhile, was collapsing under its own weight. Informants, once unthinkable, had become commonplace. Men who had sworn oaths of silence now wore wires, their loyalty traded for lighter sentences. The streets of Brooklyn, once ruled by the five families, were filled with new kinds of criminals, drug dealers, street gangs, and outsiders who didn't follow the old codes. The elegant, disciplined world that Colombo had once known was gone. And yet, there was something poetic about how he remained untouched by it all. While the world changed, while bosses fell and empires crumbled, Joe Colombo stayed exactly as he was, a silent monument to a lost era. In his stillness, there was a strange kind of immortality. Then came May 22, 1978, the day the newspapers finally ran the headline that many had expected, but few had wanted to see: Joe Colombo dies after 7 years in coma. He had never awakened. After years of fighting infections, surgeries, and complications, Joe's body had finally given out. He passed away peacefully, surrounded by his family, his hand in Lucille's. The news hit the underworld like a soft echo of a gunshot, not loud, but deeply felt. The last link to an era of boldness and defiance was gone. Joe Colombo was dead, but the legend remained. His funeral was private but attended by hundreds. Black cars lined the streets outside the church in Bensonhurst, the same Brooklyn neighborhood where his story had begun. Old-timers, men with lined faces and gray hair, stood quietly under the sun, hats in hand. No one spoke loudly. There was a somber respect in the air, not just for the man, but for what he represented. Reporters hovered outside, cameras ready, but there were no dramatic scenes, no speeches. Just a quiet farewell to a man who had once made the entire city stop and stare. Inside the church, the priest spoke of redemption and forgiveness. He called Joe a devoted husband, a father, a man of faith. Outside, in the whispered tones of the gathered men, another eulogy took shape, the one only they could give. He was a good boss, someone murmured. A stand-up guy. He had guts. After the service, his coffin was carried out by his sons. As it passed, some of the old soldiers made the sign of the cross, while others simply nodded in silence. The coffin was placed in a black hearse, and slowly, the procession began its journey to the cemetery. It was a modest funeral compared to the scale of his life, but perhaps that was fitting. Joe Colombo had once been larger than life, but in death, he became what all men must: quiet, human, and at peace. At his gravesite, Lucille stood with her sons, tears in her eyes but her posture proud. She whispered a final goodbye, the words only for him. The sky was clear that day, the wind gentle, the city skyline glimmering faintly in the distance, the same skyline Joe had ruled, loved, and ultimately lost. In the weeks that followed, newspapers printed retrospectives of his life. They called him the mob boss who became a celebrity, the activist Don, the man who tried to humanize the Mafia. Each article told a slightly different version of his story. Some painted him as a hero, others as a manipulator. But none could deny that Joe Colombo had changed the narrative forever. He had turned the Mafia into something it had never been before: visible. He had dared to walk into the light, to confront the government, to speak to cameras, to turn fear into influence. And for that, he had paid the highest price. In the years that followed, his name would appear in books, films, and even songs. Actors would study his gestures, historians would debate his motives, and journalists would trace his legacy through the generations that came after. But for those who had known him, Joe Colombo wasn't just a story. He was a memory, of laughter, of ambition, of danger, of charm. A man who believed, perhaps naively, that he could change how the world saw men like him. In the end, his story was both triumph and tragedy, the tale of a man who rose from Brooklyn's crowded streets to stand at the center of America's spotlight, only to be struck down by the very forces he had tried to control. And as the years passed, the legend of Joe Colombo would only grow, told and retold, shaped by time, carried in whispers, immortalized in the endless night of New York's history. The city moved on. But somewhere, in its heartbeat, his name still echoed, faint but enduring: like a ghost that refused to be forgotten. Years after Joe Colombo's death, New York had begun to shift again, not only in its skyline, but in the rhythm of its streets, in the unspoken codes that ruled its underworld. The Mafia, once woven seamlessly into the fabric of the city, was no longer the untouchable empire it had been. The days of silk suits, smoky backrooms, and carefully balanced family alliances had given way to paranoia, betrayals, and wiretaps. Yet, even as the world evolved, Joe Colombo's shadow lingered, an echo of a time when one man dared to stand in the spotlight and declare his power openly. For many who had lived through that era, Joe's story remained unfinished. Some believed he had been a martyr for Italian-American pride, a man who fought not just for himself, but for the dignity of a community long painted as criminal by default. Others saw him as the architect of his own downfall, a mob boss who broke the oldest and most sacred rule of all: never attract attention. But as the 1990s unfolded, a new fascination began to bloom. Filmmakers, journalists, and true crime authors turned their gaze back toward the golden age of organized crime, the 1960s and 70s, and at the heart of that era was the enigma of Joe Colombo. It started with documentaries. Black and white photos of rallies, grainy footage of Colombo shaking hands with crowds, and snippets of his fiery speeches filled television screens late at night. Viewers, many too young to remember the man himself, were captivated. He didn't look like a villain. He looked like a leader, confident, articulate, almost noble. The narration would remind them, in calm tones, that behind that charm was a man accused of running the powerful Colombo crime family, one of New York's notorious 5 families. Yet, there was always something magnetic about him, something that blurred the line between mob boss and folk hero. Books followed. Journalists revisited old police reports, unearthed letters, and interviewed retired detectives who still remembered the day Colombo was shot. Some described him as dangerous but visionary, others called him reckless, a man undone by his own ego. The duality fascinated readers. In one sense, he was the embodiment of the American dream, a poor Brooklyn boy who built an empire, who became a household name. But in another, he was the perfect cautionary tale, proof that even the most powerful man can fall when he mistakes attention for invincibility. And then came Hollywood. Directors who had grown up during the Mafia's heyday began crafting films that romanticized the world of loyalty, betrayal, and power. The Godfather, Goodfellas, Casino, all inspired by the real-life figures who had once ruled New York streets. Though none mentioned Joe Colombo by name, his influence was woven through them. Francis Ford Coppola's The Godfather, in particular, carried eerie parallels. The idea of a powerful crime family patriarch, the tension between tradition and modernity, and the theme of visibility versus secrecy, all mirrored Colombo's real struggles. In fact, some historians noted that when the first Godfather film premiered in 1972, the same year Colombo lay in a coma, the timing seemed almost poetic. The movie's careful depiction of Mafia honor had been shaped, in part, by the very protests Colombo himself had organized through the Italian-American Civil Rights League. It was an irony no one could ignore: the man who had tried to reshape the Mafia's public image ended up inspiring the most famous portrayal of it in cinematic history. As the decades passed, Colombo's name became a reference point in documentaries and interviews about organized crime. His boldness, once seen as foolish, began to be viewed as revolutionary. In a time when other mobsters hid in the shadows, he had walked into the light, not because he wanted to expose secrets, but because he wanted to redefine them. He had tried to show the world that Italian Americans were more than gangsters, even as he remained one himself. There was a strange nobility in that contradiction. Academics studying Mafia history began to debate his motives. Some argued that his activism was a calculated move, a shield to deflect law enforcement scrutiny. Others believed he had genuinely hoped to build a movement that transcended organized crime. The truth, perhaps, lay somewhere in between. For Colombo, image and reality had always been intertwined. He knew the power of appearances, of storytelling, of controlling the narrative. In many ways, he was ahead of his time, a man who understood, long before the age of social media and 24-hour news, that perception could be as powerful as truth. And so, as the 2000s arrived, a new generation discovered his story not through fear, but fascination. Podcasts and online videos retold his life in tones both reverent and analytical. True crime enthusiasts described him as the mob boss who tried to go legitimate, the celebrity don, the activist gangster. His old speeches resurfaced online, snippets of his voice still carrying that blend of confidence and charm. "We are not criminals by blood," he had said once, his tone calm yet defiant. "We are Americans, hardworking, proud, and unfairly judged." To listeners today, those words sounded almost prophetic. At the same time, the city he had fought to represent had evolved beyond recognition. Brooklyn, once gritty and divided, had become a patchwork of cultures and ambitions. The neighborhoods Joe had walked through in the 1950s were now filled with coffee shops, boutiques, and artists. The old social clubs had closed, the men who once ran them either gone or forgotten. But the spirit of those streets, the defiance, the pride, the loyalty, still whispered through the cracks of the pavement. For Colombo's descendants, the name still carried both weight and warmth. His children and grandchildren rarely spoke publicly, but within the family, his memory remained alive. They spoke of his laughter, his stubbornness, his love for Sunday dinners and Sinatra records. To them, he wasn't a symbol of power or rebellion, he was just Dad or Grandpa, a man who had dreamed big, even if his dreams had led him astray. And perhaps that is where Joe Colombo's story found its truest meaning, not in the rise or the fall, not in the headlines or the bullets, but in the paradox he left behind. He was a man who sought to humanize the Mafia but was destroyed by the very humanity he revealed. He wanted to be both boss and bridge builder, feared and loved, hidden and famous. In death, he became something else entirely, a symbol of the blurred lines between good and evil, between crime and culture, between myth and man. Tonight, when the lights of New York shimmer across the East River and the city hums with the endless rhythm of ambition, somewhere in those echoes is the ghost of Joe Colombo, watching, perhaps, as his legend continues to evolve. A man once trapped between two worlds, one of loyalty, one of legacy, now living forever in the space between them. As the 21st century unfolded, the story of Joe Colombo began to feel less like a chapter from organized crime history and more like a parable about the strange intersection of power, fame, and identity. His name no longer stirred fear in the streets of Brooklyn, nor did it draw headlines in New York tabloids. Instead, it had settled into something gentler, quieter, a legend whispered in documentaries, discussed in late-night conversations, or revisited in the dim glow of YouTube videos made for listeners drifting off to sleep. The fascination with Joe Colombo persisted because his story carried something timeless, the tale of a man who had tried to rewrite the rules of both the Mafia and the world beyond it. In a sense, he was the first gangster who understood the modern age, an era when image could be power, and publicity could become a weapon sharper than any knife. Long before social media, Colombo had crafted his own platform, his own public identity, and his own cause. But the cost had been fatal. By the 2010s, interest in his life had found new life through podcasts and streaming documentaries. The voices narrating his story were often calm, analytical, almost soothing, the kind of tone that drew listeners in late at night. They spoke of him not as a monster, but as a mystery, a man whose choices reflected both ambition and desperation. In these retellings, Colombo's rise through the ranks of the Mafia was described like a slow-burning symphony, the rhythm of Brooklyn streets, the hum of Italian diners, the quiet conversations in back rooms. The narrators painted him as a visionary trapped in a brutal system, a man who believed he could reform an empire built on silence and blood. Viewers and listeners were captivated by the contrast. Colombo wasn't just another gangster chasing money or control. He seemed to crave recognition, a place in history, a legacy that went beyond crime. And in that craving, people recognized something deeply human. Because in truth, Joe Colombo's story was not just about organized crime, it was about the universal desire to be seen, to be understood, to matter. As audiences revisited his life, one question kept surfacing: what if Joe Colombo had survived? Would he have changed the course of the Mafia? Would he have continued to build his civil rights movement, using his influence for something greater than himself? Or would the system he lived in have swallowed him whole, no matter how noble his intentions? The mystery of that "what if" became part of his enduring allure. Every generation needs its tragic figures, men who walk too close to the sun, who defy convention, and who fall not because they are evil, but because they dare to want more than the world allows. Colombo had become one of those figures. In classrooms and criminology lectures, professors now used his case to illustrate the transformation of the American Mafia, how, in the span of a single decade, it went from an invisible force to a national obsession. Colombo's boldness had cracked open the curtain, allowing journalists and investigators to peer inside an empire that had long thrived in secrecy. It was a shift that would forever change law enforcement's approach to organized crime. Yet, at the same time, cultural scholars found something poetic in how Colombo had blurred the line between myth and reality. His public rallies, his defiant speeches, even his near-theatrical confidence, all of it had the texture of performance. He wasn't merely leading a movement, he was playing a role, one that he had written for himself. In many ways, he was one of the first celebrity criminals of the modern era, a precursor to a world where crime, media, and fame would become deeply intertwined. When films and television shows continued to explore mafia themes in the 2000s and 2010s, The Sopranos, Boardwalk Empire, The Irishman, Joe Colombo's ghost seemed to hover just beyond the screen. Not as a direct character, but as a spirit, the reminder that behind every boss, behind every code of honor, lies the fragile heart of a man trying to define his place in a world of chaos. For true crime enthusiasts, his name represented a turning point, the moment when organized crime stopped being just a criminal enterprise and became a cultural narrative. Joe Colombo had, in a way, written the blueprint for how society would perceive the Mafia in the decades to come. Meanwhile, in Brooklyn, the physical traces of his empire had faded. The social clubs were long gone, their windows boarded up or turned into coffee shops. The old gathering spots of the League were unrecognizable, replaced by apartments, shops, and glass-walled offices. Yet, if you walked through certain blocks at dusk, when the city softened and the air smelled faintly of rain and pizza dough, you could almost imagine him there, his tailored suit, his steady gaze, his quiet confidence. Those who still remembered him, a handful of old-timers, retired detectives, and aging soldiers, often spoke of him with a strange mix of respect and regret. He had guts, one might say. But he forgot the rules. Another might add, he wasn't like the others. He really believed in what he was doing. And perhaps that's what set Joe Colombo apart. For all his flaws and contradictions, he seemed to believe in something, whether it was justice for Italian Americans or a new vision of power that didn't hide in the shadows. In a world ruled by cynicism, that belief made him dangerous. As the years went by, his image softened in the public imagination. He was no longer remembered as just a mob boss. He became a symbol, of ambition, of rebellion, of the thin line between hero and outlaw. Some called him the People's Don, a title that carried both admiration and irony. Even today, his story resonates because it mirrors the eternal rhythm of human ambition, rise, triumph, hubris, and fall. It's the rhythm that beats through every legend, from kings and revolutionaries to artists and dreamers. Joe Colombo's life followed that rhythm perfectly, a man who reached for greatness, who tried to defy fate, and who was ultimately undone by the very spotlight he sought. Late at night, when documentaries retell his life in low, soothing tones, the hum of the narrator blending with soft jazz or the faint murmur of city sounds, listeners drift into a strange calm. They hear about a man who once ruled the streets of Brooklyn, who faced presidents and police alike, who loved his family and his fame in equal measure. And as the story unfolds, somewhere between truth and legend, Joe Colombo comes alive again, walking the streets of a long-gone New York, smiling that confident smile, believing, perhaps, that his story would never end. In the gentle glow of memory, he doesn't seem like a villain or a saint. He feels like something far more haunting, a man who simply refused to be invisible. In the quiet rhythm of the years that followed, Joe Colombo's story began to drift into the strange territory that lies between history and myth, that soft, uncertain space where fact and memory blur. The streets he once ruled were no longer the same, the names of his associates had faded into dust, their empires swallowed by time, their codes forgotten by new generations who had never heard of omerta or the sacred silence that once bound men for life. Yet somehow, Joe's name endured. It didn't endure because of fear, or because of crime. It endured because his life had taken on a strange poetry, a man who rose from Brooklyn's narrow alleys to stand beneath the blinding lights of cameras, who spoke to crowds like a politician, who dreamed of justice while living as an outlaw. It was a contradiction too powerful to fade. By the 2020s, true crime culture had become a phenomenon all its own. Streaming platforms, podcasts, and YouTube channels breathed new life into stories of the past. Listeners curled up at night, headphones on, as narrators with calm, measured voices guided them through tales of gangsters and power, loyalty and betrayal. And among those names, Capone, Gotti, Luciano, Joe Colombo's voice rose again, softer but somehow clearer than before. For younger generations, his story was something new, not a headline, not a cautionary tale, but a narrative about ambition and humanity. They listened as the storytellers described the man behind the myth, the devoted husband, the father who believed his children could grow up in a better world, the mob boss who wanted to be seen as a civil rights leader. In the quiet hours of the night, the line between sinner and dreamer seemed to vanish. And perhaps that was the secret of Joe Colombo's lasting hold on imagination. He was a man of dualities, gentle but ruthless, idealistic yet self-serving, private but drawn irresistibly to the public eye. His contradictions made him real, even decades after his death. In the long arc of Mafia history, Colombo had played a pivotal role in changing how the world perceived organized crime. Before him, the Mafia had been an invisible empire, one that lived in silence and shadows. After him, it became a subject of fascination, studied, debated, filmed, romanticized. By breaking the code of secrecy, he had unintentionally opened a window into that hidden world, and once it was opened, it could never be closed again. FBI reports from the era described how his activism, through the Italian-American Civil Rights League, made law enforcement rethink their strategy. The League had drawn attention not only from Italian-Americans who felt misrepresented, but also from government agencies concerned that Colombo's movement was blurring the line between community advocacy and organized crime. He had turned public relations into power, and for a while, it worked. But time has a way of softening even the hardest truths. Today, many who speak of him do so with fascination, not judgment. They imagine him standing on that stage in Columbus Circle, his voice strong, his presence magnetic, thousands cheering his name. They forget, for a moment, the darker parts of his story, the racketeering, the coercion, the endless games of loyalty and control. Instead, they see the man who dared to be visible in a world built on invisibility. As technology advanced, so did the storytelling. Documentaries began using deep archival footage and AI restoration to bring old moments back to life. Suddenly, the grainy videos of Joe Colombo's rallies appeared crisp and vivid, the sweat on his brow, the flash of the cameras, the restless energy of the crowd. People could see what his contemporaries had seen, not just a gangster, but a man of presence, someone who could command a room with a look, who could make people believe in something larger than themselves. Commentators began calling him the mob boss who invented image politics, comparing him to modern influencers and public figures who blurred the line between authenticity and performance. It was a strange but fitting comparison. Like them, Colombo understood that control wasn't just about money or territory, it was about perception. He was, in a sense, a man born before his time. His approach, mixing activism, charisma, and defiance, was both his greatest strength and his ultimate downfall. It made him unforgettable, but it also made him vulnerable. For in the world of organized crime, visibility is a double-edged sword. The same cameras that capture your rise will also capture your fall. Yet, even as these modern storytellers dissected his every move, they couldn't deny the emotion behind it all. There was a tenderness buried in his defiance, a sense of wounded pride. Joe Colombo didn't just want power, he wanted to be understood. He wanted the world to see that Italian Americans were more than the stereotypes painted in headlines and films. And perhaps, if his motives were tangled with self-interest, that didn't make them less human. Today, the league he once led is remembered less for its scandals and more for its ambition. It had brought thousands together under a single cause, giving voice to a community long dismissed. Even after Colombo's shooting, the echoes of that unity lingered. In some ways, his movement succeeded, not politically, perhaps, but emotionally. It reminded people that pride could exist even in the shadows. In a small museum in Brooklyn, among the fading photographs of Italian-American life, a black-and-white picture of Joe Colombo still hangs. He's standing in front of a banner that reads, Italian-American Civil Rights League, his face caught mid-speech, his hand lifted in conviction. Visitors pause before it, drawn by something they can't quite explain. Maybe it's his expression, the blend of confidence and sincerity, the glint of a man who believed he could change the world, even from the wrong side of the law. Outside, the city hums with its eternal rhythm, cars passing, neon lights flickering, the scent of pizza and exhaust mingling in the air. The New York Joe Colombo once knew is gone, but its spirit, its restless hunger, its defiant energy, remains. And somewhere in that endless hum, his story continues to whisper. When the night grows quiet and the city slows, when the air feels heavy with memory, it's easy to imagine him still there, watching from the corners of Brooklyn, from the shadows of old clubs, from the collective memory of a city that never forgets its legends. Joe Colombo, the man who wanted to change his story, the man who turned the Mafia inside out, the man who believed that even the darkest name could shine in the light. His tale, like the city itself, refuses to rest. It breathes on, not in the loud headlines of crime or justice, but in the soft murmur of remembrance. A story not just of power and downfall, but of vision, and the fragile, impossible dream of being remembered for more than what the world chose to see. Even after Joe Colombo's incapacitation and eventual death, the ripples of his life continued to spread, lingering across New York and beyond, like shadows cast long after the sun has set. He had been more than a mob boss, he had been a paradox, a man whose very existence blurred the lines between hero and villain, celebrity and criminal, activist and enforcer. To those who had known him personally, he was a family man, devoted, charming, capable of warmth that could soften even the hardest of hearts. To the wider public, he was the man who dared to stand on the streets, wave to the cameras, and challenge the image of Italian Americans, all while quietly running a criminal empire. The duality of Joe Colombo's life is what made his legacy both fascinating and elusive, a story that continues to intrigue historians, writers, and curious minds decades later. In the immediate years after his shooting, his Italian-American Civil Rights League continued its activities. Initially, the organization had attracted large crowds, with rallies and marches that were covered extensively by the press. Joe had a knack for speaking to people, for making them feel seen and respected, and many genuinely believed in the causes he championed. For a time, the League seemed to thrive without him at the helm, with loyalists carrying his vision forward. Yet the reality of organized crime was never far from the surface. The League, though framed as a movement for social justice, remained intertwined with the Colombo family's influence. The line between activism and power consolidation blurred with every rally and press appearance. As the years passed, the organization gradually lost momentum. Without Joe's commanding presence, internal divisions began to show. Leaders within the League had different priorities, some more interested in extending their own influence than honoring Joe's initial vision. The press, too, began to lose interest, and the dramatic flair of publicity that Joe had once wielded so effectively faded into the background. Yet even as the league dissolved, Joe's image endured. Photographs of him waving from a podium, smiling at crowds, were reproduced in books and newspapers, cementing his image as a man who had defied expectations and redefined what a mob boss could be. The Colombo family itself, now without its unifying figure, became increasingly fractured. Joe's charisma had been the adhesive holding ambitious and often volatile lieutenants together. Once he was removed from the equation, internal disputes erupted into violence, rivalries deepened, and loyalty became a fragile commodity. What remained of his power was symbolic rather than practical, a reminder that the structures he had built were heavily dependent on his personality. The Third Colombo War, a violent and tumultuous internal conflict, would later underscore how delicate the balance of authority truly was in the absence of a leader like Joe. Despite the chaos within the family, Joe's legacy extended beyond criminal enterprise. In popular culture, he came to represent a unique type of antihero, a gangster who courted publicity, a man who mixed media attention with menace. Writers and journalists chronicled his life with fascination, noting the strange contradiction of a mob boss who also championed the rights of his community. For scholars of organized crime, Joe Colombo became a case study in ambition, hubris, and the human desire for recognition. He demonstrated that influence could be wielded as publicly as privately, and that fame could be as intoxicating as fear, even in the underworld. Moreover, his life raised broader questions about identity and assimilation. Italian Americans, long stereotyped in media and law enforcement narratives as criminals, saw in Joe Colombo both pride and controversy. He embraced his heritage openly, displaying flags, marching in parades, and speaking of dignity and justice. Yet the juxtaposition of his criminal activities and public persona complicated the narrative. Was he an advocate, a manipulator, or both? The ambiguity surrounding his motives is part of what continues to captivate historians and audiences alike. Colombo's life forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about perception, power, and the ways in which people can reinvent themselves in the eyes of the public. Even in death, Joe's story continued to resonate. His hospital bed, silent and still for nearly 7 years, became a symbol of what might have been, a man who had reached the heights of both fame and infamy only to be frozen in time by violence. Family members, former associates, and journalists alike reflected on the duality of his life, weighing his contributions against his transgressions. In some ways, his legend grew larger than life, enhanced by the mixture of tragedy and spectacle that had defined his career. The city of New York itself seemed to carry fragments of his presence, from the streets of Brooklyn where he was born, to Columbus Circle where he once waved to adoring crowds, to the shadowed offices and back rooms where power and danger danced quietly together. Perhaps the most enduring part of Joe Colombo's legacy is the way he challenged the rules of his own world. Where most Mafia figures remained hidden, obeying an unspoken code of silence, Joe dared to step into the light. Where most wielded fear alone, he combined intimidation with charm, strategy with spectacle. And though his life ended in violence and confusion, that daring move into the public eye set him apart forever. In reflecting on his story, one sees not just the rise and fall of a mob boss, but a meditation on human ambition, identity, and the fragile line between respect and notoriety. Joe Colombo's name now lives in history, not simply as a gangster, but as a symbol of paradox, power entwined with vulnerability, notoriety balanced with legacy, fame intertwined with tragedy. To the casual observer, he might be remembered for the rallies, the photographs, and the headlines. But to those who look closer, there is a deeper narrative, a story of a man who attempted to reconcile loyalty, ambition, and visibility in a world built on secrecy. And in that tension lies the enduring fascination of Joe Colombo, the mob boss who became a celebrity, whose life continues to echo through the streets and memories of New York long after the final applause has faded. The city's lights shimmer softly against the river at night, and in that gentle glow, it's easy to imagine him once more, standing tall, smiling at a crowd, waving to a world that both loved and feared him. His story reminds us, quietly, that even when a life ends, the impact of boldness, ambition, and contradiction can linger, like shadows stretching across the corners of history. Joe Colombo may have passed, but the echoes of his life remain, soft yet insistent, in every whisper of the city he once ruled and the stories that continue to be told about him. After Joe Colombo's fall, the family that bore his name descended into chaos. Without his charisma to hold it together, the Colombo crime family splintered into bitter factions, each claiming the right to rule. What began as quiet tension soon erupted into the Third Colombo War, one of the bloodiest internal conflicts in Mafia history. Streets that once echoed with Joe's calm authority now ran thick with fear. Men who had once toasted to loyalty now plotted against one another in the shadows of diners and backrooms. The early 1980s became a storm of betrayal. Each capo moved with paranoia, unsure whom to trust. Meetings turned into ambushes, alliances shifted like sand. The FBI watched closely, recording every whisper, as the once stable family tore itself apart. It was a cruel irony. Joe had built his empire on unity and charm, yet his legacy was now marked by blood and suspicion. The family name that once stood for power now symbolized turmoil. Through it all, older members spoke of Joe with a mix of longing and regret. They remembered his smile, his speeches, the strange pride he inspired even in enemies. But that era was gone. The city had changed, the mafia had changed, and the illusion of control had crumbled. By the end of the decade, the Colombo family was a shadow of its former self, fractured, watched, and weary. The stage that Joe once filled with charisma and light now stood empty, echoing only with the ghosts of what he had built and lost. Joe Colombo's final years were marked by silence. After spending nearly 7 years trapped in a coma, his once powerful body now frail and still, he passed away in 1978 from complications that had lingered since the day bullets shattered his world. News of his death spread quietly, without the fanfare that once surrounded his name. For many, it was the closing of a strange, almost tragic chapter in Mafia history. The man who had once commanded crowds and cameras now slipped into eternity with only a whisper. His funeral was held in Brooklyn, under gray skies that seemed to mourn alongside the city. Old associates came dressed in black, their faces lined with age and secrets. They stood at a respectful distance from reporters, murmuring their farewells. Inside the church, the air was heavy with incense and memory. Family photographs rested near the casket, Joe as a young father, a smiling husband, a proud Italian-American. For a few moments, the world saw him not as the boss or the activist, but as a man who had loved deeply and lost everything to his own ambitions. As the coffin was lowered into the ground, the crowd stood in stillness. Some remembered his charm, others recalled the chaos he left behind. The cameras that once followed him had long gone dark. Only the wind and the quiet rhythm of prayer remained. In that moment, Joe Colombo became what every man eventually becomes, a memory. His empire scattered, his legend uncertain, but his story forever entwined with the city he could never let go of. In the years after Joe Colombo's death, his story lingered like a ghost over New York. People still spoke his name in cafes and barbershops, sometimes with admiration, sometimes with disbelief. He had been many things, a mob boss, a family man, an activist, and above all, a man who refused to stay invisible. His legacy was complicated, tangled between truth and myth. Some remembered him as the only mafia leader who dared to challenge the government in public, while others saw him as a reckless dreamer who confused fame for power. Time softened the edges of his story. The crowds that once cheered his name faded, the league dissolved, and the mafia itself began to crumble under the weight of investigations. Yet the image of Joe, standing before microphones, defiant and smiling, endured. He became part of the city's folklore, a symbol of an era when men in tailored suits ruled from the shadows but longed for the light. His sons carried his name forward, his family kept his memory alive, but the man himself remained frozen in time, forever waving to a crowd that no longer exists. When we look back now, we see more than a gangster. We see a reflection of human desire, the wish to be seen, respected, remembered. Joe Colombo's rise and fall remind us that even power cannot silence that yearning. As night settles over the city he once ruled, the lights shimmer softly across Brooklyn's skyline, and for a moment, it feels as if his presence still lingers, a calm voice in the dark, whispering from the edges of history, still searching for his place in the light.